So, to get started, first I want to set an expectation, which is, first of all, this is going to be one of the, in terms of technical content, lighter presentations. That's on purpose, right? And I also want to stipulate, so I come from a slightly similar background to Cliff Stoll. I am not like Cliff Stoll. I'll just set that from the beginning. I don't have nearly that much energy. I would break my ankle if I jumped as much as he did. But there's a lot of folks here who come from a military background or an IC background or maybe just an intelligence analysis background in general. Mine is different. I was educated in mathematics and hard sciences, right? My degree's in math. Went from there to a Unix sysadmin role for a long time. You can tell by the neck beard. And then from there to incident response and finally to threat intel because, hey, the hours were better and I knew when I would be traveling in advance. So based on that, I'm going to be talking about some of the same general sorts of ways we think about problems, but from the perspective not so much of intelligence community and military analysis, but from the perspective of science, right? And I mean here very generally the philosophy of science. So why are we talking about this? Well, so first of all, to the extent that our intel analysis or analyses in general support things that can be also classified as forensic investigation, that matters. We use that word a lot, right? To the point that science has turned it into a verb, right? To forensicate things. But the reality is that forensics has a meaning, right? When we talk about something being a forensic investigation, we mean that it can work for a court of law, for guarding public policy, or to a level of confidence that we're comfortable at being part of the national conversation. And we have that, don't we? So when we say that we're doing a forensic investigation, that is holding it to a very, very high standard that we are expecting ourselves and our colleagues to meet. And even outside of forensic investigation, the people in these sorts of buildings depend on our work, right? In the courthouses, whether it's criminal actions or it's just lawsuits and civil actions, in legislative bodies, executive branches, people running large or otherwise important organizations, they depend on what we do. And I would argue that much of the leadership of this field is in this room. So it's incumbent on us and on our colleagues to do the best work we can because these folks count on us and the quality of our work. And so I'm going to talk about three general types of areas to watch out for. Again, from the perspective of scientific analysis to the extent that we can apply it here. And the first is falsifiability. Now, this is a word that when you first look at it, if you've never seen it before, you may misunderstand what it means. To be clear, I do not mean in any way, shape, or form falsifying, coming up with false evidence, fake facts, those sorts of things. What I mean specifically are an idea that, so this is Sir Karl Popper. In the 20th century, he was one of the great, foundational thinkers of what we call the philosophy of science. And he had this idea about that he called falsifiability, which is this. If you have a hypothesis, if you have an assertion, it needs to be falsifiable in the sense that you can imagine, you can conceive of a test or a circumstance that would conceivably disprove your hypothesis. Not merely looking for evidence to support your conclusion, but if I think that this is happening because of this reason, I want to go find stuff that would invalidate my hypothesis. Because it's easy to cherry pick evidence that supports it. What do I mean by that? Okay, don't get scared. By a little bit of propositional logic, I even put it in English instead of the normal symbols that we call it. Yeah, Alex. So Alex made my heart go all pitter-patter. Well, he always does. But when I saw the equations up there, I was like, oh, that's a man after my own heart. But I simplified here. So we're going to talk about two basic kinds of statements, right? And we'll break them down in very simple form. An observational statement is just what it sounds like. I see this. There exists at least one black swan. Just one. A categorical statement says about all objects of a type. And a categorical statement says, all swans are white. Now, what kind of evidence do you need to prove, or more importantly, disprove your statement? In order to prove that there's a black swan, you just need to find one black swan. In order to falsify it, though, you would need to go through every single swan in the world and show that none of them are black swans. That's really hard to do, right? Categorically, the same thing. Categorically, in order to say all swans are white, to prove it, you've got to go through all the swans in the world. That's a real pain to do. Again, somebody's inevitably got one hidden that you can't see. But to disprove your categorical statement, you just need one black swan. So we think about, as we're making assertions, think about the kind of evidence that would disprove your assertion, and try to find that kind of evidence to the extent that you can. The next thing is cognitive bias. We've talked about that a little bit this week. Now, when I say bias, it's really important to understand in depth what we're talking about, because that word has some emotion associated with it, right? You're biased. Doesn't feel very good when somebody says that to us. We are not talking at all here about any kind of intentional or even cultural kinds of bias. There's some overlap in things that can be cognitive bias and that sort, but really we're focused here on bias in a technical sense. So bias in a mathematical sense really just means a systematic deviation from the true value, right? So think about it in terms of a scale. A biased scale is one where either the 0 point isn't right, or maybe as you put on 1 pound, it reflects more or less than at 1 pound systematically. That would be a biased scale. In order to then make sure that our scales and our analyses are free from bias, we have to do the same thing. We have to calibrate carefully and constantly and regularly verify that our process is free from bias. So what are some cognitive biases to watch out for? There are a bunch, and I'll have a reference later to more. But here are 3 that I personally find particularly important in my work and in looking at the work that we as a discipline do. And the first is confirmation bias. And this is relatively straightforward to understand. Confirmation bias says that I pay more attention to evidence that matches what I already think than to evidence that doesn't. Right? We see how this ties in a little bit to falsifiability. So, you're looking at a bunch of evidence, you started to, in your mind, kind of generate a hypothesis, and now you have a couple of data points that don't align with it. Confirmation bias says, oh, those are probably not valid or not credible because they don't line up with what I already think. Or somebody who disagrees with me is less credible, not because of what they're actually saying, but because they disagree with me and therefore they're not worth paying attention to. That's dangerous when you're thinking critically and you're trying to think accurately. A framing bias, I guarantee everybody who's ever worked with incident response or network security has run into this. From one side or the other, maybe both, right? So imagine you have a system that has an outage of some sort. A framing bias can happen in both directions. The incident responder immediately says, it's probably an intrusion. A communications disruption can mean only one thing, invasion. Thanks, iDiddle. See, I knew somebody would get that. The sysadmin comes in and says the opposite. It's an outage, it's just an outage. Probably Windows had to reboot or a disk got filled up or what have you. The framing bias looks at the problem from only an existing perspective rather than being open to both possibilities and looking at evidence that would support or tend to go against one conclusion or the other. Fundamental attribution error is my favorite. Well, no, it's not good, right? But it's my favorite to think about because we all do it in our day-to-day lives, and it's not good there, but here I'm talking about our work, and it's really not good here. Fundamental attribution error says this: when you make a mistake, I say it's because of some core characteristic about you. When I make a mistake, it's just the individual specific circumstances. So there's a car accident. If I'm in a car accident, oh, the sun reflected off of somebody else's window and I couldn't see, or somebody else did something. I just couldn't avoid it. There's nothing I could do. Somebody else in a car accident, oh, they're an idiot driver. They don't know what they're doing. Maybe it's something about their gender or their ethnicity, or just in general, everybody else is an idiot, but I'm smart. That's fundamental attribution error, because they're thinking, by the way, the same thing about you. That jerk cut me off because they're an idiot driver, and I know that you just made a mistake, or maybe there was some valid reason, right? These are cognitive biases that we have to be careful, among others, right, that frequently affect the kind of work that we do. Finally, logical fallacies. Oh, I could go on and on for hours. I won't. We all want to get out of here. I know we've got flights to catch and stuff. About logical fallacies. So let's talk about a few that are relevant here. The association fallacy is relatively straightforward. So let's think about this Venn diagram, right? We can look and we can say everything that's in circle A, all A, right, is also inside circle B. Everything that is of type A is also of type B. All A are B. Got it. All A are also in C. Everything that's in circle A is also inside circle C. Straightforward. So far, all of this is on track and absolutely correct. The association fallacy says all A are B and all A are C, therefore B equals C. Clearly, that's not true when we look at the whole picture, right? Clearly, we can see there are a lot of elements in B that are not in C, and vice versa. But we make the mistake of saying that because there are at least some elements that are in both groups, therefore those two groups are basically coincident, and that's not true. That's the association fallacy. The sharpshooter fallacy, an aside, is often called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. I'm from Texas, and I take issue with this. We all know that it's the Oklahoma sharpshooter fallacy. The sharpshooter fallacy is basically like this. A guy goes out and shoots at the side of a barn. Afterwards, he goes up to the barn, finds a cluster of his shots that are closely grouped, draws a circle around it, and says, that's the target I was shooting at. This is not right, right? There are two kind of general types of problems. They're closely related. They're really different perspectives on the same problem here. One is, in our work, right? You can't use the same data that you use to generate your hypothesis as you do to prove or disprove it, right? It becomes circular. So if you say, yeah, it has special application in Alex's work, right? If you say, I'm going to look at these logs, I'm going to find, oh, I think this is what's happening. Now I need to go get a new set of data, maybe the next day's logs or a different set of logs, and see if I can make that same observation and see if I can confirm or invalidate my hypothesis. The other thing is, that's fine. Maybe you were, but what about all the other shots outside of that? That is, we tend to look at evidence, at the similarities among evidence, and not try to account for the outliers that could also be valid measurements, right? Great, you were shooting at the target. What happened to all those other things that went off target? Why was that? How good of a sharpshooter are you? And finally, the streetlight effect. I remember hearing this as a kid, and I just loved this story. So imagine it's a cold, dark night. Somebody's lost their keys in a parking lot. And they're looking for their keys. They're going everywhere trying to find them. And along comes, let's say, a parking lot attendant, police officer, security guard, whomever. Somebody who's willing to help. And they say, hey, what's going on? I lost my keys somewhere. I'll help you find them. So they're looking around. They're looking under the cars and everywhere and not finding it. And finally, the parking lot attendant says, are you sure you lost them here? No, I lost them over there, but the light's better over here. Okay, so just because you have more visibility in an area doesn't mean that's the right place to be looking for what you're trying to find, because that may not actually be where it is. Don't make that assumption, especially if you already have a prior reason to believe that's not where it is. This is the streetlight effect. Now, I talked about a lot of these general classes of problems, and you can drill down into great detail into any one of them. But how do we compensate for these? How do we compensate for these fallacies, these biases? How do we make sure that we are falsifying our hypotheses? And aside, some of us were talking about this, I think, at lunch today, it is really, really important not to get confused on the distinction between a hypothesis and a theory. Colloquially, we say, oh, I got a theory about what just happened. No, you don't. You have a hypothesis. The scientific method we learn as kids, right? You get some initial data, some initial observations, you generate some hypothesis, now you get some more data, new, fresh data like we talked about, right? And as you find evidence that supports this, eventually you can support it, and you have evidence to back it up, and now it's a theory. Okay, that aside. The first thing I would say is go back and watch Rob Dartnell's talk today, because that's literally just a fantastic laundry list of ways to compensate for these. I'm going to talk about two in particular. The first one is red teaming. And here, I don't really mean red teaming in the network security sense, although that's kind of a special case of what we're talking about here, right? That term came from somewhere, right? In science, before a paper or a result has any acceptability at all, it should go through peer review, right? We talk about, you've heard the term, maybe, peer-reviewed papers. Rob referred to kind of a similar idea as a murder board, albeit scientists are gentler people. We call it a peer review. They're not really that gentle. It literally is the same thing, or sometimes meaner, right? But the idea is that somebody else is reviewing your work specifically with the idea to find problems, to find weaknesses, to find mistakes. They're going to go and they're going to say, you make a conclusion here that is not well supported by your data because of this reason, or you've made a mistake in this calculation, or you missed these important things, or you didn't reference this other work because of this. That's red teaming. That doesn't mean they dislike you. Well, maybe they do. It doesn't matter. Because it's about, as I loved the line earlier, we're here to defend our organizations, not our ego. This is also true for any kind of analytic work, right? We're here to accomplish some mission, not to feel good about ourselves. Maybe that mission is to advance understanding of the world, and maybe it's to defend an organization. Either way, red teaming helps us avoid. There are a whole, but you can formalize it the way that he talked about. It can be as informal in a smaller organization or in a tight cell where you say, hey, I'm going to go over to a buddy over here who maybe she knows much more about it than I do. I'm going to say, hey, can you look at this before I send this out and find tell me what's bad about it. Seriously, be merciless. That is the point. Because if you're, let's say that you're providing something that's going to go to court, you can guarantee that's the opposition's job. You're providing it to a policymaker or a decision maker. They can be even more ruthless because their neck is on the line for the decision that's going to be made, right? So red teaming says, let me do this in advance and have somebody else try to see what I didn't see. The next one, Mike's heart just went pitter-patter, is analysis of competing hypotheses. Now, to me, when I first saw this, I said, well, duh, this is what we learned like in third grade, right? But it's a formalized, structured way of carrying out the scientific method. The basic idea, again, we've talked about it several times this week, and for good reason, because that's how important it is. You list your observations, you list the possible explanations, you assign some level of credibility to your observations, and you see which ones are consistent and which ones are not. This is literally a formalized method of what we all learned when we were 10 years old or whatever. You're finding hypotheses, you're seeing how it supports it, and hopefully ruling some out. With that said, before I close, I want to talk about one thing that happened last night that's relevant here. When we were at I hope you all enjoyed, those who were able to come, the hot cocoa at our Sands ski chalet. And one of the things that Rob Lee led off with was the question, what makes you optimistic about our field? And I got to tell you, as you could probably tell if you were there, I quibbled a little bit with the premise, right? I'm not necessarily, that doesn't mean I go to the other extreme, right? You can be not super optimistic and yet still be not cynical. I'm not necessarily optimistic, but I want to be optimistic. And there's a reason for that. And that is because you inspire me. And I hope that we inspire each other. The work that we're doing, as I said at the beginning, is important. Some folks are working in national security or law enforcement. Some folks are working on other issues of literally vital, I mean life and death here, importance. We saw with Sergio's talk earlier about his Global Emancipation Network. Even when the work that we do is more prosaic and not necessarily life or death, it certainly impacts people's livelihoods. Even if we're protecting credit cards, right? That has a financial impact on real people. So the work that we do is important, and I know that we take it seriously and we want to do the best that we can to support the missions of whatever organizations our work benefits. And so because of that, I want to reemphasize the importance of doing this accurately and rigorously, because ultimately that is really what we're for, is to support those missions.